audible?
Just keep that up. Yeah.
My presentation today focuses on findings regarding participation in the gold monetization scheme as drawn from the Pan-India IGPC price survey on the saving habits of households. And more specifically, it focuses on the potential positive effects of how one's neighbors may be behaving affects this participation. It is a working paper, but with what I felt were relevant first impressions, and it echoes the sentiments from the discussion in panel 1, which Soom had moderated. So I believe the audience needs very little introduction to this scheme, which was introduced in 2015 and enables holders to deposit golds with banks for an interest. And so far, the scheme has only received limited interest, and several reasons have been identified for the foundering state of the scheme, including low marketing. And picking up on that strand, I'm checking whether adverting to participation of proximately located peers could actually enhance participation. And this is notable because this would be a less costly and less time consuming solution than those discussed above, which require a sort of a structural transformation. And so the motivation for conducting this study arose from the review of data wherein we observed that there were abnormally high and low responses to the scheme in certain districts, and more importantly, certain localities within districts, which prima facie appears to be attributable to peer effects. To illustrate, you can see the unexpected levels of awareness in state capitals where we'd expect that the level of awareness would be higher than the rest of the state. For instance, in Bombay and in Hyderabad and even in Bangalore. You can also see that the percentage of households which have deposited in certain localities is higher, even though those in the neighboring ones are far lower. So these are just wards within a sub-district where we can see that some have recorded, some 83% of households have deposited, surveyed households have deposited, whereas others in the same sub-district haven't. So to identify whether the hypothesis is true is critical for two main reasons. And the first is that this area is untouched in the literature, possibly due to limited data, though the hypothesis is not entirely implausible because literature does record that there is a role of peers in augmenting financial market participation. And secondly, if such interaction does yield helpful impact, then it bodes well because it would be expected to have a multiplier effect and not as much effort would be required to put in to promote the scheme. Naturally, to accurately assess whether peer effects are responsible for high levels of participation, one needs to control for other factors which could have affected whether a household chooses to participate in the GMS. And as per the literature, the following aspects are likely to have an impact. The data which indicates the presence of these factors is also mentioned below that. Financial literacy, which can be due to education, but not necessarily, and it depends on the nature of education and whether it imparts the relevant skill sets. Prior experience in dealing with investment products and rural and urban location of the household. The perception of liquidity, a lot of which arises if a household has actually used gold for pledging, and accessibility of formal lending channels, which tend to motivate people to hoard gold. Affective attachment, which could depend on the number of females in the family who may be having sentimental attachment to one specific piece of jewelry, though not all, because they are often related to a particular occasion. And economic circumstances such as affluence and affluence relative to others, which feeds into conspicuous consumption, something that Professor Roy had actually adverted to in his presentation, and the number of non-earning members. And of course, accessibility, because if the relevant stakeholders like the banks and CPTCs are located too far away, then travel time tends to add disutility to the participation. Uh, Before we begin to look at the econometric model, I would like to highlight the main variables here. The main explanatory variable comes from the response to the following question asked by the price survey to 2 lakh households in the listing data, out of which 43,000 were included in our final analysis. For my analysis, I've coded the response as 1 when the household says 1. They have heard, they are aware, and have actually deposited under the GMS. And if they have not deposited, then the response has been coded as 0. So basically, to simplify, I've focused on whether a household has deposited under the scheme or not. The main explanatory variable of interest is the percentage of households in the locality, which are meant to be about 100 households in the physical vicinity which have deposited in the scheme. And the household characteristics which I've referred to as controls are on the screen. and their summary statistics are as follows. So basically, I have referred to the per person annual expenditure in the household, which is meant to be a signal of affluence, the rural versus urban location, the number of non-earning members, whether the highest level of education in the household is college level and above, and whether the household has invested in one or more of gold ETFs, SGBs, or coins. And to include a reference to a steady source of income, I have also included a binary variable which checks whether the household has access to steady source of income, for example, a public sector salary. I've removed those households whose income belong to the lowest decile, which was 85,000, since the lowest income groups are in any ways not the potential targets. We are looking at affluence households who have surplus gold, as Som had referred to in his session. The limitations in the data as follows. The number of females could reduce the inclination to deposit because of effective attachment. There are district-wide controls that need to be included. So, for instance, in terms of volatility of income sources within that district, disparity in the incomes, and the nature of the income source and the types of sources. The timing was a concern here, since these observations depend a lot on census data and government surveys, and which were outdated at the moment and will be included as and when more reliable data comes along. It would also have been ideal to have these controls at the level of localities rather than districts for a more specific assessment. So I adopt a linear and means model where the outcome variable for each household depends linearly on the characteristics, the mean outcome of that variable for the reference group, which is other households in the locality, and the mean characteristics of this group. The approach has been commonly adopted for examination of effects from arising from interaction with group members by other authors too. For instance, Duflo and Sai's study whether there is an influence of colleagues on a person's participation in retirement saving plan. Similarly, Gershina and all refer to study the effect of an immigrant's stock market participation, and whether it affects the investment choices of natives from the same country residing in a municipality. Uh, so, while it has been a common practice to follow this specification, the associated issues are well recognized. To start with, there is no literature to suggest that the relationship between the behavior of individual households and those residing in the locality would necessarily be linear, which is what this model assumes. Nor can it be assumed that if it is in fact observed to be linear in one study, the same thing would be applicable to other contexts too. This issue could be partly resolved by including binary choice models such as logistic, which transform a linear combination of regressors into probabilities. Apart from that, the specification could have following problems. The similarity in behavior could be attributable to an exogenous characteristic of the residents of a location, which encourages this observed common behavior. For instance, if the jewelers in a region are looking to take the advantage of gold metal loan schemes, then it's likely that they'd encourage their consumers also to deposit under the GMS. And and this could be an exogenous effect that actually affects participation rather than peer interaction. It's also possible that there are correlated effects. For example, since residence is not randomly assigned, it's possible that membership could be a consequence of a certain similarity in the individual characteristics, which contribute to similarity in behavior rather than the interaction. For example, if affluent gold hoarding households contribute to GMS deposits and a particular locality has wealthy residents, then the wealth rather than their supposed interaction would be leading to high participation. To some extent, this can be resolved by controlling for the exogenous factors and inclusion of instrumental variables. So this slide shows the model that I intend to estimate. Each household in the sample is characterized by a vector y, x, z, and u, where y is the outcome of interest. It is a dummy indicating whether the household under observation has deposited under GMS. X identifies the specific location where the household is based. Z and U are individual characteristics of the household that influence Y, Z being the observable aspects and U being the unobservable scalars. The expected value is the average of Y in a given location, but it excludes that individual I so as to avoid a purely mechanical correlation between the outcome variable and the explanatory variable. And this slide sets out the results from the model on the previous page. The strong and statistically significant effect of the explanatory variable is evident. So if we look at the coefficient 0.9753, so this behavior does seem to be influenced by peer interaction. Uh, it is also interesting that the location in a rural setup actually seems to contribute positively to a household's tendency to deposit, and that requires some further evaluation to see why that may be happening. It could potentially be due to stronger networks existing at rural levels rather than urban levels. Further, those who pledge are also more likely to deposit. So it could be that actually the lower income groups are not depositing, actually not even pledging their gold. In fact, keeping it for a rainy day and instead selling it when it's required. So those who are pledging may also be likely to deposit if the returns are correctly advertised to them. The effect of college education, non-earning members, and affluence are as per our expectations. So is the fact that those who invest in gold products, for example, transact in SGBs, ETFs, and coins, are more likely to participate under the GMS. And even steady incomes, which arise from which we have taken to mean incomes from a public salaried source, don't seem to impact GMS participation because the results are not statistically significant. The issues discussed above in respect of linear in models are evident from the test conducted to check for endogeneity. To address the above, I employed the method of instrumental variables. The chosen variable was the location-wise average of a dummy, which indicated whether the portfolio of the household had one or more of financial gold products like ETFs or SGBs, since it shows a tendency of the household to treat gold as an investment, which also propels one to deposit in GMS. Further, this IV is indicative of a tendency which is not manifestly visible to other households. So, for example, if a household trades in ETFs or invests in SGBs, the other households may not necessarily be aware of it. So it's likely that it impacts the dependent variable through the regressor. And the results after including the IV are still encouraging, and statistically significant, though adjusted slightly downwards. So 0.97 has now become 0.94 here. I also checked the F statistic, and from the critical value, it can be seen that the IVs explains the endogenous regressor as well. This actually brings me to the end of my presentation. In terms of way forward, the district level controls at the right timing need to be included in the model. Nonetheless, I believe that this is a positive pattern, and the results identify how well the inclusion of reference to similarly placed others participating in GMS can yield more participation in future. It also indicates, fortunately, that once conversion begins, it can sustain itself and magnify with proper marketing. And since it derives from a household's internal evaluation of the scheme, it could possibly be habit building over time. With this, I wrap up and thank all of you for your time.
Thank you. That's a lot of input for the marketing people to say how they could probably make people aware of it, and also how they can make people incentivize people to come up. I mean, using Instagrams with normal people speaking about, oh, I did this and I got this. And second thing is, you made a very interesting point. Those who have invested in one of the products like ETF or sovereign gold bond are more likely to invest in GMS or open to GMS if it is made easier. That is a very interesting point, because that actually again changes the marketing, the way we approach marketing. Because whenever people go to open any demat accounts, it is possible now at least to trigger a thought by asking, have you deposited your gold in GMS and opened a ETF account or something like that? So that people at least think. They may not invest immediately, but I think at every such point we must. But it's a lot of input for the marketing people. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.